Welcome to It's an Inside Job, the podcast where we equip you with actionable skills to build resilience, enhance communication, foster well-being, and lead and coach with impact. I'm your host, Jason Lim, and every Monday we bring you expert insights and real-world stories to help you thrive and succeed. And with that said, let's slip into the stream. Well, welcome back to the show, and thank you for allowing me to be part of your week. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Simona Costanzo Sow to the podcast. Now, Simona is the Chief of Academic Partnerships at the United Nations System Staff College, or the UNSSC, where she brings together her academia, policy, and society to tackle some of the world's toughest challenges. Now, her work focuses on helping leaders in the UN to think more holistically, to embrace creative and innovative ways of leading and thinking and sharing knowledge, and to navigate the complexities and the challenges and the changes with more purpose and creativity. And this ability to communicate, collaborate, and cooperate across agencies, cultures, and nations is so critical at the moment, especially considering where we are in world affairs. Simona's career spans the UN, civil society, academia, and the private sector. She has a deep passion for capacity building, community empowerment, and fostering collaboration across sectors. In this episode, we discuss leadership strategies at work. She shares practical approaches to tackle complexity and lead with more clarity and purpose. We talk about the power of partnerships, learning why building strong connections across sectors is key to driving real change. And that could be departments, that could be nations, that could be agencies. And we also talk about diversity of culture, opinions, and professional experiences that can enhance the ability to navigate complexities and thrive in uncertain times, which many of us face. So if you are up to this conversation, well, I'll see you on the other side of this introduction. So let's now slip into the stream and meet Simona Costanzo Sow. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back to It's an Inside Job. Simona, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jason. Great to be here.
Can we kick off by you introducing who you are and briefly what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm Simona Costanzo Sow. I'm Chief Academic Partnerships at the United Nations System Staff College. That's the Learning and Training Institute of the United Nations System. I've been in this job for just a bit over a year now, but I've been actually with the entity for quite a few years, working as what we call a learning portfolio manager, managing courses, programs, offerings, particularly for UN personnel around systems leadership, around the 2030 agenda, and around essentially ways to address complexity in today's world. Before that, I actually worked a lot with and in civil society. I was working with the United Nations Volunteer Program for a number of years, managing policy advocacy and working with member states on a number of issues around civic engagement. And before that, managing a civil society organization that deals with civic engagement, community empowerment, and volunteering.
And I find what you do interesting. We've had the privilege, or I've had the privilege to have worked with you to some extent a few years back. And what I'd like to explore with you today is to tap into your deep knowledge and experience on leadership. You work with leaders of the UN and across the globe. I was wondering, maybe you could speak a little more about how leadership or leaders within the UN at different levels, how it has evolved from your perspective.
Thanks for that question, Jason. I think over the last few years, there's been increasing recognition that we live in a world of polycrisis. There are so many things happening at the same time. There is acute awareness that the effects of climate change are becoming more and more visible, tangible, and having effects on people's lives. Things like the global pandemic showed us that an issue that might seem a health issue actually ends up affecting so many sectors of our life, so many aspects of our life. And in that sense, I think what has changed is that is that understanding that no matter what expertise you come from, no matter what your specific mandate is or your specific job description is, you're going to have to have a holistic approach to it. You're going to have to address complexity. You're going to have to understand how what you do connects to the work of others. And I think that fundamentally shifts how leaders look at themselves. You have to move away from thinking that you're the expert in something, you have the answers, you can tell people what to do, to essentially understanding what the spaces in which you are acting, who the actors are you need to take into consideration, and how you can make the most out of that collective knowledge around you.
I think that's a very interesting thing, because a lot of leaders, a lot of us, we've, if you've been on the planet for a few decades and working in a professional sphere, that we've gravitated to some level of expertise, whatever that may be. And we become very specific in what we do. And I can understand how difficult that would be to have that shift in mindset, becoming very sort of localized, specific, and expert, to broadening our perspective with the complexities that you speak to. I mean, from your raw and unfiltered experience working with leaders, how difficult or maybe how easy is it for these professionals, these leaders that you work with, to shift from being very specific to looking at things from a much more context or system-oriented perspective?
It's not necessarily easy. I think theoretically everyone understands that what they do is connected to other topics, but it is true that, and like you said, people who've maybe been around for a couple of decades, they have built their sense of self based on that understanding that they are an expert in a particular area, and the very entities they've been working in have established their sense of self in having a very specialized mandate. In fact, in the UN, we talk about specialized agencies. We have the UN Secretariat, which sort of oversees and coordinates, but then we have the specialized agencies that deal with issues specifically like children or education or health or food systems. And of course, if you've established your credibility, and if also you've probably been recruited because you are an expert in that field, or you were already working maybe in a government in that particular field, you come in with an understanding that that is really what you should be focusing on. And expertise remains relevant. I mean, that is also something a lot of people tell us and say, oh, are you now saying, that we shouldn't be experts on anything anymore and everybody should be generalists? And of course, that's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is, if you are a leader, being a leader in an organization doesn't mean having the answers. It doesn't mean you need to lead people in the sense that they come to you, they have a problem, and you need to give the answer. And that is probably often the biggest resistance, that people say, yeah, but that's what my staff expect from me. That's what our counterparts expect. We come in as the advisors. They tell us, this is the situation. What are we supposed to do? And then to step back and say, look, I'm not going to give you a straightforward answer, whether that's with your staff member or whether that's with your government counterpart or your civil society counterpart, but to say, can we sit down and try to understand the bigger picture collectively? Who do we need to bring in? How do we convene them? What do we make out of the data we're getting, the information, the evidence we're finding? That's really challenging because it requires a different skill set. Instead of being the one who sort of individually thinks through what the solution to the problems might be, you need to become much more of a broker and a facilitator rather than an advisor or sort of the one who has the answers.
And that would speak to a lot about that particular leader building the level of trust and confidence in their people, especially if it's direct reports. And sometimes that's very difficult, especially their type of leadership. And they want to tackle everything themselves, right? Because they may not have the confidence. Logically, they know their people can do it. But emotionally, sometimes that's a whole different hurdle, especially when the stress and the pressure's on. They think, you know what, if I can just do this myself, I have 20 years of experience in this. It'll be a lot faster, and I don't have to spend a lot of time following them up. I mean, how do you encourage leaders in your training and your programs to overcome this type of cognitive bias, if I may call it that?
Yeah, no, and I was actually just going to use that word of bias. I think, first of all, indeed, by raising awareness of the fact that we all have implicit biases, because that's not necessarily evident. So, we'll look into exercises, reflections that actually bring out those biases, because most of the time, if you have many years of experience, many things happen on autopilot. You use the answers and the solutions that you've applied before. You feel like you've seen it all, you've known it all, you know the approaches of your entity, you know what you would typically reply in a particular situation, etc. And of course, a lot of that is based on biases in terms of your worldview, what you believe are successful actions, who you believe, what you expect different actors to think or to do. So unraveling those biases is actually a big part of our work. So we do role plays, simulations, we have these conversations, we try to essentially also underline the necessity to value different perspectives, also, and value different perspectives, again, both within your team. So making sure you have different people and you have that environment of trust that actually allows these different people to bring out their views, but also with your counterparts. So realizing that maybe if you're trying to solve an issue around public health or around food systems or around child mortality or whatever it may be, that the insights of the local population, the insights of the people who are actually affected by the issues you're trying to address are incredibly important. That if you don't understand what matters to them, how they look at the world, what they know about their context and their surrounding, what issues they're facing with and how they see that and what kind of solutions they can imagine, you're not going to find a good solution. So yes, you said, there can be a sense of impatience because, of course, there are a lot of counter incentives saying, there's money, there are timelines, you function on annual plans, you have limited budgets, you've signed up for a very specific goal in that project for which you got money. So there are a lot of counter incentives to more holistic and complex solutions. And you have to be very aware of that so that you can also tell. Sometimes you need to tell your donors, look, yes, we said we would do A, but it now turns out that no longer makes sense. So there's a lot at stake here. On the one hand, it's about, first of all, do you realize that you need to change approach? Are you taking the time? Are you giving yourself the space to realize that, to articulate these things? And then are you able to communicate that to the people you work with? So you might have to have a hard conversation with a counterpart or a donor to say, the timelines we had in mind are not realistic. It's like this African proverb that says, if you want to walk fast, walk alone. And if you want to walk far, we need to walk together. And of course, it might sound cheesy, but really it's at the end of the day, it's about that. It's like, can we take a step back and say, okay, we're caught in a system that wants us to be efficient, effective, fast, timelines, and that wants us to come to linear solutions based on clear assumptions. If I do A, it'll lead to B, and that'll ultimately lead to C, and that will achieve D. And you give me money for that, and within 2 years we get to D. Well, but that's not how it works. Things happen. There are connections you cannot anticipate. So it's also, can we move our systems into more adaptive systems, into more agile systems? And in fact, what we do is not just working with the individual leaders, telling them, challenge the system, try to find a different way, battle the constraints that are around you. But the system itself, the UN system itself, has realized that internally it needs to work differently. So there are also a lot of reflections in the UN system in terms of, incentivizing this different way of working. Of course, these things don't happen within a day. So I would say there's a realization at the top. There's a lot of specific guidance now also at the top, encouraging more agile, more adaptive ways of planning and implementing and communicating. And we try to convey that also to the people on the ground. And then you have the resistances essentially in the middle. But I think the overarching journey, there's an understanding on the top and on the bottom that this is the only way forward.
Adapting to complexity is one of the hallmarks of a resilient organization, of resilient leadership. And as you said, it's to move away from linear thinking because a lot of things are associative now. And as or at least from my perspective, anecdotally, with all the complexities that this world is seeing right now, as you mentioned some of them, the polarization of nations, the decoupling of globalization, climate change, everything else. This complexity is so vast. I mean, when you look at individual leaders, I mean, how are how are they adapting? So, I mean, we can talk about systems, we can talk about communication, we can talk about agency and such. But when it comes down to the individual psyche of some of the leaders and some of the challenges and the horrors and the maelstroms that they see where they work, what have you seen to be effective to try to overcome, to try to find a sense of agency and autonomy in a world where many people can feel a sense of hopelessness or despair or feeling powerless? I know this is kind of a deep question, but again, I think these are relevant questions a lot of people are trying to struggle are struggling with right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's definitely not easy. And I think if you think of, also many of our colleagues who are active in crises around the world and absolutely, very easily waking up in the morning, you could despair and say, how is it possible that after, next year the UN is turning 80, and it was built based on this idea that the UN, first and foremost, should protect humanity from war. That was, we after the disaster of World War II, there was an understanding that this should never happen again, and we should find a way for people to come together. Where there should be ways to resolve conflicts other than by resorting to violent means. And yet, we've never had as many conflicts around the world as we have right now, and things don't seem to be going in a good direction. So one could wake up in the morning and say, why am I even here? Like, what, is there any sense in what I'm doing? So when you ask me what we see, how leaders adapt, I think already coming together, stepping out of the daily work and being able to articulate what's going on is incredibly important. For instance, during the pandemic, in the very beginning of the pandemic, the World Health Organization, or one of its regional offices, reached out to us and say, "Can we co-create a space where the leaders of country offices can come together and just reflect on what's going on here?" As you can imagine, if you are the head of a WHO office in a given country, and a pandemic breaks out, all the television, all the journalists will be in front of your door in the morning. So all of a sudden you have to give answers. You are in the limelight. Everybody will scrutinize what you're doing. And maybe you got into that position because you were a very effective medical doctor and a manager, but not necessarily a public speaker. So there's incredible pressure at that moment. So being able to provide a safe space where people can reflect about what's happening and connect with their peers. And when I say connect with their peers, not necessarily the immediate colleagues that are at the same level in the same country or in the neighboring country, but maybe with people in a similar kind of situation, but not that close to home. So, for instance, in UNSSC, we organize courses for leaders from different agencies and different countries coming together. Sometimes it's easier to share with someone who can relate to you because they are in a similar situation, but they're not in your same agency or they're not in your same country. So you're not really dealing on a daily basis with that person, but you can share, about some of the challenges you're facing. Another thing that we see people do is really taking time for themselves, finding opportunities to reconnect with themselves, stepping out in the moment of crisis, realizing that your immediate reaction, sort of the, thinking fast and thinking slow, your immediate hunch in terms of your fight or flight reaction, that you need to deliberately find techniques and ways to get out of that. So we also, try to introduce elements related to mindfulness, related to ways to relax, to essentially be able to understand what's going on and find a calmer a calmer self. So stepping back, sharing, and remembering why you're in there. Sometimes just asking people to say, okay, can you remember that moment when you decided you wanted to work in an international organization, or you wanted to combat poverty, or you wanted to, when you started your journey, what motivated you? What excited you? What is one thing that really motivates you in the morning in this job? And just remembering, what's my purpose? Why am I here? And maintaining that hope that at the end of the day, even if you're not solving the big ticket issues, you are making a difference to the people around you, and you can move the needle, even if in small ways, and that it requires people like that. So refinding the motivation also in that deeper sense of purpose is quite important.
I just like to backtrack because I think a lot of what you said is very salient when it comes to teams dealing with crisis or individuals dealing with crisis, however that crisis is defined. One of the things I really like hearing from you was that, you got these different leaders together, whether it was face to face or Zoom or Teams or what have you, where they sat together. They came from different parts of the agency or different parts of the UN, had different roles and responsibilities. But collectively, that group of 6, 8, 10, 12, what have you, they were able to articulate their thoughts and emotions. Logically, they know everyone's going through this, but emotionally, a lot of us can get stuck in that loop of rumination, overthinking, like everyone else is coping, why can't I? But by creating a sense of group therapy, talking to our biases, our fears, our anxieties, our concerns, what happens is when we articulate those abstract thoughts and words into concrete emotion, concrete words, then, for a lot of them, when they're sitting in those sessions, and again, I also speak from my own experience, all of a sudden, we hear our thoughts and emotions out loud. And as you said, instead of being reactive, those conversations allow us to be reflective, to actually hear our words. What are the significant of the words? Are they just irrational fears? Are they worries? And by hearing a group of people talking about, it normalizes it. This is an normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And everyone, regardless of rank and file, where they're located within the UN system, they're feeling it too. And the other one I think is really good, because I think that's a really good step one, per se. A step two is just asking, it's taking time to reflect, pulling out yourself out of the bubble and finding a way, whether it's walking in the woods, sitting by the ocean, looking at the sky, listening to music, kind of finding that buoyancy, recollecting yourself. And I think the third point to ask is what I really like is to reflect. Why did I start? Well, what is the reason I started at the UN? What is the reason I started this post or this job? To go back to the initial passions. Because I think that's a dangerous question to ask when we're in a very reactive, dysfunctional mindset. I think going through what you've just said, and then finally, once we find that buoyancy cognitively and emotionally, then that's a great ask. Because sometimes if we look over the trailhead of where we've been through and what we've accomplished and the hurdles and the obstacles that we've conquered, that we've come past, that can fuel us because no one can take that away from us, Simone. That's our track record. That's fact. Anything in the future is just speculation. But I think it comes back to what you said. It's to go back to that passion, the motivation, the purpose. What is the reason I do this? And I just wanted to kind of break it down because I thought what you said is very, very effective, right? It's not a quick fix. It takes time to talk through these things because logically we can accept something. And again, I speak from my experience, but emotionally, it takes us time to process the complexities that are coming at us. And there might be multifaceted complexities that may be attached or detached from each other. And it's trying to compartmentalize this. So I just wanted to give you kudos for that because I think that's a really constructive and astute way forward for a lot of people dealing with complexities and stressors.
No, thanks, Jason. And indeed, while I was listening to you, it made me think of a couple of things. And in fact, in UNSSC also over the years, obviously we are trying to adapt to what our audiences need. And we're trying to always have our ear on the ground in terms of what we can do to really accompany that journey to the best of our ability. And I think one thing we've increasingly introduced in our trainings or learning and sharing formats is coaching, whether it's peer coaching, where we provide exactly that space, a safe space for people to share among themselves and sort of guiding them a little bit in terms of, what kind of questions can you ask? How do you listen? How do you create an atmosphere that allows your partner to really unpack themselves, what they're experiencing, and identifying solutions that work for themselves just because of how you listen, because of the kind of questions you ask, because of the kind of atmosphere that starts creating. And that's incredibly powerful, both for the ones developing, ideating their own solutions and the ones sort of accompanying them on that path, and everyone playing both of those roles, because it creates a whole different sense of agency. So that's one thing. And the other thing I think that is also quite important is, while in the UN system, and not just in the UN system, I think in the realm of international development, we come from a logic of sort of technical assistance, technical solutions, specific subject matter sector expertise that would need to be conveyed. We have a completely different image of the world now. It's not about the ones who know and the ones who don't know, and you just need to bring them together. It's not about clear, maybe complicated, but still linear solutions that you just need to know how to implement. It really is about all countries in the world facing challenges. In fact, there's no country in the world that can say that it has fixed all the issues, regardless of, if we look at gender, climate, inequality. I mean, give me one place on earth that doesn't have issues in any of these areas. And it's about really then looking at, okay, how do you read the situation? So it also means we need to strengthen people's political acumen. It's not just about what's the technical expertise you need to bring, but also how do you understand the interests and the influences in the space that you are trying to address. And again, these are things you cannot do at a desk by yourself or based on a book. It always requires you reaching out to other people, other stakeholders, people who don't speak your technical language. So another thing we're trying to do with our counterparts is to talk about effective communication, and essentially, accompanying people as they learn to talk about their area of expertise in a language that others can relate to. Because it's great if you have your jargon and if you know to say very complicated things that make you come across as a wonderful expert. But if people who are not from your field don't understand what you're talking about, you won't be able to see how what you do fits into the bigger picture. So that's another important part of our work, actually, to say, don't be afraid to say things in simple ways. It's not taking anything away. On the contrary, in fact, there's this quote that's attributed to Einstein that says that if you're not able to say something in simple terms, it might be because you don't understand it well enough yourself. I don't know if I'm reading from Einstein, but I like the quote. And so really one key message we send out to the leaders is to say, don't be a hero. Don't try to solve things yourself. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to seek help. On the contrary, if you don't do that, there's something wrong. Like if you can't say, I have no idea about this topic, who can help me here? And convey also to the people you work with that it's totally fine if they're better than you in something. I mean, ideally, a leader should want to recruit the best people in all the various issues that they need to deal with. It should be, you should want someone who's better than you at comms for your comms team, someone who's better than you in partnerships in your partnerships department, someone who's better than you in that particular technical area where you need someone. And so another thing we often do is to just get people to talk about what they need, because they're so used to coming across as, someone who doesn't have flaws and who has all the answers. And just to say, relax, we're all intimidated by what's going on around us. We live in a world of not just complex problems, but wicked problems. No one has the answer. And really, even to define, if you talk about things like a pandemic or climate change, there are so many different worldviews that come into play, so many interests and influences, so many possible different ways, so many unknowns where we don't know, tipping points, questions on what'll happen, by when it'll happen. But you have to navigate that without pretending that you have the answers. And I think just feeling that that's okay, and actually that's a prerequisite to then be able to address that complexity, is really important.
In the first part of the episode, we talked about how leadership within the UN is evolving to address interconnected global challenges, such as climate change and the pandemic. We discussed the shift from a domain-specific expertise to embracing more of a holistic, collaborative approach, and the difficulties professionals face in broadening their perspectives. Now, we also touched on the important factor of leadership in complexity, or in complex systems. Tackling the challenges of trying to navigate complex systems. Well, in our conversation, we explored the importance of overcoming cognitive biases. It's about also fostering trust and building adaptive, agile leadership systems. Simona, she emphasizes that communication and resilience are the cornerstones for leading in such polarized, fast-evolving environments. Another point we talked about was leadership in crisis, and I'm sure many of you have been there. She reflected on the need for leaders to step back during crisis. For example, she brought up the pandemic, which was such a game changer for many of us. She talked about the processing of emotions and staying connected to a person's purpose. We touched on mindfulness, peer support, and creating safe spaces for reflection to empower each of us under pressure. And I can't emphasize, enough of that, because many of us, when we are under the pressure, when we are under the gun, we will tend to react. And that's a normal part of how we think. But what is important to do is to actually book time with ourselves, to step out of the bubble and to reflect. Because through reflection, that allows us to see more objectively, more calmly, what we need to do to move forward. And this is, in essence, equanimity and resilience. Now, Simona also talked about group reflection and coaching. I'm sure at some point in your professional career, you have thought, why is everyone else calm? Why is everybody else able to ride this out? And I seem to be, in my own inner storm where it's tumultuous and turbulent. Why can everyone else get their things together? Well, many of us feel like this. And by having group reflection, by having group coaching, what that does is it allows a number of professionals to share their thoughts openly. And we find that it's not only us, but everyone else seems to be going through the same crisis internally themselves. And then we find out that this is actually kind of that this is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And so this is something that Simona talked about. She underscored the importance of creating these spaces for open communication and the ability to share our thoughts, to share our vulnerabilities in order to shift perspectives. Because sometimes we can't change the situation, but sometimes we can find a much more productive and objective way of dealing with the situation through shift in perspective. And just to circle back to vulnerability, in our conversation, it emerges that vulnerability is actually a key strength in leadership. Simona highlighted the value of seeking help, acknowledging limitations, and obviously building diverse teams of opinions and of experience. And here's the key. By embracing vulnerability, it makes leaders more adaptable, more resilient, more human. And that makes them better at fostering an environment of trust and capacity building. Okay, let's slip back into this brilliant conversation into part 2 with my fascinating guest, Simona Costanzo Sow. Part of what NATO's done is learned a lot from American communications. And they talked about where the leader talks about the what's and the why, what we need to do and why we need to do it, the reasoning behind it. But the how, they leave it to their experts. They leave it to the people out there because it's sort of centralized command, decentralized control. And this creates a sense of flexibility, a tenacity, a fortitude, a resilience within an organization. And what you're saying is right on the money. Because I think a lot of old world, per se, mindset is that I'm the leader, I should know everything, and I employ people around me to do with that job. But what I hear you're saying is not a revolutionary thinking, but I think it is a vulnerability, and I think it is actually a strength, where we say that, yes, I am the leader, I'm the manager of this group, but I have people who know 1,000 times more about what they do to employ and to execute on what they have to do. I'm just here to coordinate things, per se, to fight for resources upwards if they need it and such. So I think what you're saying about vulnerability is just that. There's a strength, there's a courage, there's a boldness in vulnerability, saying, you know what, I don't know everything. And that makes you human. And that just sort of deflates anyone's ego, right? They don't become so self-focused that, you know, I am the encyclopedia for everything in this particular field. Like, come on, please. Right. So I just wanted to, again, give you kudos for that, Simona, because I'm complete agreement with what you've just said.
Yeah, no, and the kudos, of course, go to all the people working in the agency, because this is something that is, you know, quite sort of an organizational or an institutional approach, and that we also then share about to make sure that across the house, you know, we learn from each other, because the same applies, you know, when you are then in that role of building capacity or enhancing the learning of your partners, to then think about, okay, how is this evolving? What can we do differently? And what you just said, you know, about leaving the how to the people in the middle, of course, requires a lot of trust. It requires that trust that they will sense what needs to be done when it comes, because they will probably also not be able to tell you exactly what they'll do at the different steps. And in the UN system, that is really a big discussion over the last year, to say, okay, how can we include that level of adaptability? Because, of course, when you're in a big bureaucracy, on the one hand, you need rules, you need steps, you need guidance, you know, here's what you should do, and it's in this sequence that you should do it. But in the UN, and especially in the UN development system, which is sort of the part that deals essentially with addressing poverty, dealing with health, education, and also the wider well-being of people, there's a lot of talk now, you know, when the UN turned 75, so that's, you know, 4 years ago, there was a moment of reflection to say, okay, what should we be changing going forward? What are some of the key issues UN personnel should do more of? And member states asked the UN Secretary General to come with a couple of ideas and proposals. And he came back what was called our common agenda. It looked on the one hand at what are those big challenges? How should we change? What are the big issues that the UN should embrace differently? And then there's one sub part of that, which was called the Quintet of Change, or it still is called that looked at, okay, what are the specific behaviors, ways of working that we should adopt? And it essentially underlines, first and foremost, that we have to get into a much more forward-thinking culture, so that we should embrace and value agility, creativity, that learning per se should become much more something that everybody embraces, and adaptability, so that we should get much better in championing diversity. We should bring in more youth perspectives, and of course, really look at those core values that the UN has been embracing ever since, around integrity, humility, humanity. And then it lines out like 5 specific things where it says, okay, no matter what function you're in, this is something you should be taking into account. One is data. Like, you know, if we want to gain valuable insights, we really have to get better at collecting data and in understanding how to interpret that. Second is, in general, leveraging the digital transformation, you know, using the tools and the platforms that are out there in a way that it enhances our collaboration. If we say we need to address complexity in more effective ways, we need to get a better sense of who's doing what where. I mean, we need to get much better in connecting across agencies, across functions, across countries. The third one is innovation, you know, fostering an environment where people can take risks, where it's okay to not have a full-fledged linear, clear theory of change of what will exactly lead to what, but making your assumptions explicit and getting a bit of a space where you can take risks. Still, big challenge, because bureaucracies don't like risk takers, but at least there is now an understanding that really we need to build that in. The fourth one is foresight. So, how do we actually ensure that we have better capacities to look at trends, to see what kind of shifts might be coming, and how can we sort of try to shape the future proactively? And the last one is behavioral science. So it's essentially looking at the knowledge we have of human behavior to understand, how do people tick? How can we accompany them in such a way that essentially we get them or people, if we look at things like health, like education, so understanding much better how we can develop strategies and interventions that take that into account. So again, this is still in early days for the Quintet of Change, but already to know that this is the direction of travel, that very clearly, the UN has understood that this is something we need to foster among all staff. And it helps us when we organize our trainings, capacity development measures, because now everyone wants those kinds of skills. Before, I would say we've been obviously trying to work in that way for a long time. But now it has really become the talk of town.
That's fascinating when you consider, how things are moving so much forward. Talking to students and university students and moving forward, a lot of it is about skills such as communication, as collaboration, cooperation, creativity. All of these are these human functions that we need to deal with the complexities. The era of linear thinking, in some regards, it's still around, but the complexities that the UN faces, you and your folks face, I mean, as you said, maybe it's bottom up innovation or linear or sort of lateral innovation, creativity, bringing different viewpoints and opinions, right? Not everything's going to float. Some things will sink, but the whole point is to table as many ideas. It's about sort of divergent thinking, I think, first. Just let's collect all the ideas we can, and then we can do convergent thinking. Then we can start, culling some of these ideas, sinking some of these ideas to see which ones actually really float.
Yeah, no, you said something very important. The divergent thinking is really also something we put the finger on because of course, typically, if you become a leader or a manager in a UN entity at the highest level, depending on the agency you're in, depending on the trajectory you've had, again, you may have gotten there because you were a subject matter expert and did a fantastic job in that regard. So the idea of divergent thinking, which also means not just analyzing, breaking down into pieces, but looking at what there is, finding new connections, and again, using creative approaches, allowing crazy thoughts, essentially, is not exactly what may have gotten you to where you are. So breaking that down. But having said that, it's also liberating. I don't want to paint the senior leaders as some sort of, expert bureaucrat who has trouble opening up. I think for a lot of people, this is also getting rid of a straitjacket, saying, well, we've been sensing this all along. We've been, these people have been around. They have a lot of experience. Of course, they understand the relevance also of taking different kinds of knowledges into account and getting an endorsement also from the outside saying, you're supposed to do this is incredibly important. And I think what we're seeing over the last years is really that what we used to dub the soft skills is really not soft skills, but it really is the glue is at the core of then making a difference. But just one thing I also wanted to say, because of course, we're painting a rather optimistic picture in terms of the direction of travel. And of course, it's as always, it's one step forward, two steps back, because while on the one hand, I think this realization that we need to go in a different direction, that we need to embrace complexity, that we cannot easily quantify exact solutions in a short term that would, allow us to sort of exactly give you a trajectory of what success looks like. That also requires a lot of trust from donor countries. The UN organizations depend on the readiness of the countries that make up the UN to provide them with the means to do so. And there, unfortunately, we also see a lot of backtracking. We also see a lot of skepticism in the multilateral system, a lot of skepticism in what the UN can and can't do. And that is also weighing a lot on the ability of the UN to work, and also of the people comprising it to feel enabled and in a situation that they can really make a difference. So we're always between those two, trying to convey that sense of hope, trying to foster these kinds of behaviors, mentalities, capabilities, fully cognizant that the pressure that they are exposed to and the expectation that comes from the outside world, also, how the UN is perceived in some of the countries, et cetera, is not necessarily always going in the right direction. So there's a lot of tension in that sense.
Well, with this quintet of things you were talking about, sort of data, innovation, foresight, behavioral science, and so on, by focusing on this sort of, maybe it's not a whole new direction, maybe it's just a pivot, a slight degree moving into things and holding on to the things that work well, but improving the things that don't work so well, changing or eliminating certain things. And as you said, it's for a lot of people, regardless of age, maybe it's slipping off that straitjacket, those handcuffs, and there's a lot more liberation and autonomy and an agency in thinking and adapting to the complexities that we've touched upon during this episode. But I think also what you said, maybe a step forward, two steps back. And it's when you're talking about so many different nations and cultures and opinions, and it's trying to find a way forward. It's like migrating into a whole new territory. It is only through the discussions and sharings of opinions, and some of those are going to be really hard conversations. There's no doubt about that. Some infighting and dialogue and debate or what have you. But slowly, it's an iterative process that I hear you're talking about, Simona, and then slowly we will populate this map, this new territory, but it's a constant migration forwards. And it's exactly that. It's not just about positive wishful thinking. We need to be optimistic, but we also have to be constructive, understanding that sometimes the storm is there and we can't avoid the storm. We have to move through it, and we're going to get buffered and beaten around a little. But as you said, it's not a park. It's not a walk in the park. This is a steep climb up a very treacherous mountainside, if I can mix metaphors there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even, again, being able to have that conversation, when very often when we start a course or training or a fireside chat or whatever it might be, sometimes there needs to be a first moment of venting, because you can't go in and say it's all rosy. We have these wonderful tools. Member states love us. We just need to now convene the right people, find the good solutions, and things will go forward. I mean, people come with a lot of frustrations. They come with a lot of sense of, I'm receiving so much negativity. I'm facing financial constraints. There's so many counter incentives for the collaboration to go the way that it should, and the signals are not positive, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes we need to start with, okay, get it all out. What are all the things that frustrate you? What are all the things that you feel are not going in the right direction? And then essentially we come to that point where we say, okay, so now what? So is it that bad that you should actually put the key under the door and walk away? Because really, if there's nothing you can do and if it's horrible, maybe you shouldn't do what you're doing. Maybe then really, then change career. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the reaction is, no, of course not. I mean, we do see that we make a difference. We do see there is value in what we do. We do see that the people need us. For instance, I say, okay. Well, then in that case, can we concentrate on what that is and how we can enhance to the best of our abilities and how we can connect, and what we do with that. So essentially, like you say, it's about resilience. It's about, in a way, seeing the bigger picture, but then also focusing on what is within your sphere of control and your sphere of influence. There's a huge sphere of concern out there that can bog us down every day for all the reasons we mentioned. Mm-hmm. But then if you if you decide to continue that walk, and if you decide to continue to be hopeful as a radical way of believing that change is possible, well, then you have to work on what is within your sphere of influence, what it is that you can do, and how you can show up as the best of your best self to play that role in the best way possible.
Yeah, and I think what you've said, the ability to vent and validate emotions as maybe the first part of any conversations, dealing with people's frustrations and concerns and worries, then they feel listened to, that their emotions are legitimate, that we're not trying to, you know, look at everything through rosy colored sort of glasses per se. But no, this is the reality on the ground. This is the tough things that we're facing. But once we've dealt with that, once people feel they've been listened to and they feel validated, then we can start asking more well-engineered questions that could not about positivity or optimism, but about constructive mindsets about, okay, so how do we deal with this? What do we need to have in place? You were also talking about sphere of influence. I'd just like to segue into something you were talking about re-interview. You talk about the notions of power with, power to, and power within when it comes to leadership and influence. I was wondering, could you kindly elaborate on what those three terms are and how that shows up in your
Yeah, no,
training or what have you?
absolutely. No, thanks. And I think this is a really important notion. And in fact, like as I said before, we talk a lot about political acumen, and we talk a lot about the need to actually take interests and influences into account. And when we say interests and influences, we really say power. And in the past, like power used to be like a four-letter word in international development, because it was like that's what people in international affairs and relations deal with, and people negotiating between countries. But you can't talk about development without looking at power relations, without looking at spheres of interest and spheres of influence. And of course, when we talk about power, there's the notion everybody knows, the power over, sort of the power of hierarchy, the power, the formally invested power. And then when we look at the power that people have to organize, it can be broken down in different ways. And essentially, in order to address the more formal power relations that are out there, in order to shift the needle in terms of pursuing goals in a country, first of all, people need to have power with, and that power within. So power within means essentially that the individual has a sense of agency. If I don't feel that I can make a difference, or that it's okay for me to want to make a difference, I'm not going to organize with someone else. I'm not going to look at myself as someone who could possibly move the needle. So it starts with power within. I need to have self-confidence. I need to have a sense of self-worth, and I need to have self-knowledge. And that is an important aspect to consider, to say, is that population we're talking about, is that little girl in the village, in the remote area, does she feel that her voice counts? Does she feel that the way she experiences the world is relevant, and that the needs she has are worth being articulated? And that then gives you the power too. It gives you the power to shape the world, to making choices, to project yourself into a future. It makes you capable to decide your actions. So it's sort of, if you have power within, it gives you power to make decisions, project yourself, etc. And then that gives you the power with, meaning based on that, you can find common ground with others, you can organize, you can bargain, you can essentially build collective power through solidarity, through joint action, through organization. Now, those are concepts that are mainly developed in the context of civil society, when you talk about, advocacy, campaigning, things like that. But in the same way, when you are the leader of a UN entity that looks at, how do you want to shift behaviors in terms of understanding of education, public health, food systems, what have you, it is very important that as you analyze the populations you want to work with, that you don't look at them as beneficiaries. That's a very old term that we used to use to say, okay, so you just look at it, it's like a passive population that sits there and you decide what to do.
Like a charity, yeah.
Exactly. And now, of course, if you really want to move the needle in the long term, it's about co-creating solutions. It's about providing spaces for people, but you will only have people showing up in those spaces and saying what they need or how they see the world if it starts with the power within. If you convene a group of people who don't have the power within, they will still sit there and say, okay, tell me what you want me to do. So that's a little bit like breaking it down can also help be more specific in terms of what you're actually trying to do with an intervention and what you're trying to achieve with it.
So if we looked at this as a sort of a pyramid or a building structure, power within is setting a solid foundation of agency, autonomy, where people feel a self-knowledge, self-worth. They feel there's a level of self-confidence and self-esteem that they can, that their voice counts. And we could just bring it back to any organization. If you're looking at a team, regardless of what that team does, that power within is to give that team a sense of agency, where it's not just command and control. Well, I tell you what to do and you go off and do it. I think it comes back to what we're talking about. I'll let you have the expertise in this. I want you to figure out how to do it. We will create certain guide rails and check-ins and such, but doing it. And then that leads to power to, which leads to power with. So the foundation comes back down to that sort of that psychological safety, that psychological strength of setting that sense of autonomy and agency, that sense of liberation that I can influence the world around me, not as an individual, maybe as an individual, but also as a collective. And what I also hear, and again, please forgive me if I'm taking liberties here, is that it's not just all these experts dropping into a local area saying, this is what we're going to do. You are the charity or the beneficiaries of this, but you tap into the local knowledge to actually understand, to collaborate, to cooperate, to figure out, cooperate.
It has one co already, yeah.
Yeah. But to cooperate with them, to use their knowledge to build something, right? So I just wanted to say that I think this has been a brilliant conversation. I'm very respectful of your time, Simona. Is there any last thoughts or suggestions or advice you would like to share with our audience today?
That's a good question. And no, thanks a lot for having me, Jason. And maybe just one thing I wanted to say about the power within before coming to the last thoughts. Power within, respecting the power within sometimes also means respecting the limitations, the value systems, the worldview of the people we're working with. Because power within, doesn't only mean that we need to make sure people are ready to act or have this sense of agency, but it also means we need to respect where they stand, how they look at the world, and sort of not come with pre-made concepts or ideas of what they should want, and really respect that. And I think that is also a big shift in how we look at the world and how we design the way forward collectively. In terms of a last thought, I think it's just to really respect that, we don't know what we don't know, to embrace that sense of complexity as a great opportunity. It allows us to co-create every day. It allows us to seek answers every day, to learn every day. It really is an opportunity to value what others bring to the table. So I think once people get over that intimidation of being in a constantly fluid world, in a world where nothing is clear, once you embrace that idea of being adaptive, of co-creating with others, it really is worth the journey. And I just like to encourage everyone to open themselves up for that and see that as an opportunity.
Well, Simona, thank you very much for sharing your deep knowledge and experience. I think it's been a brilliant conversation, especially at the UN level, where you are training these professionals that go out into the world to make a difference. And it speaks so much. You've touched on so many foundational stones to resilient and adaptive leadership that, we could write a book together about this. But thank you today very much for your time.
Thank you.
There was a lot to take away from that second part of the conversation with Simona. Perhaps you as a professional are facing a level of complexity, change, or challenge right now. And the question is, how can you create an environment where new ideas can thrive? Perhaps for yourself, maybe it's something you individually need to figure out, or perhaps you lead a team. And the question is, how can you foster a forward-thinking culture that values creativity and adaptability? We also talked about navigating complexity with confidence, And it's almost like a martial arts where sometimes we need to go up the belts, the colored belts, to become a black belt in confidence to deal with complexity and change. Simona talked about some of the things that she emphasizes amongst UN leaders. And that's the emphasis on trust and the iterative progress and constructive dialogues as a reminder to approach uncertainty with patience and a willingness to learn. And I think that is such a key, the willingness to learn. So when we're faced with complex problems, break them down, involve diverse perspectives, and focus on making incremental progress rather than expecting immediate solutions. And again, we've spoken time and time again, focus on the effort, the actions, and not always the outcome. The outcome is important, but what leads us to the outcome is even more important. We also discussed the dynamics of power over, power to, and power with. I want you to reflect on your own relationships, with power and of influence. Are you empowering those around you? Are you collaborating effectively to achieve shared goals? Are you building stronger connections by recognizing the value that each individual brings to the table? It doesn't mean you have to always agree with what they're saying, but diverse opinions, diverse viewpoints, diverse experiences, well, that's resilience. That's adaptability. That allows you to evolve in complex situations. And I think something that really resonated to me, something that was very salient, was that sometimes we get up and thinking, what's all this for? I keep struggling and hammering away every day, and it doesn't seem to make a difference. Now, these are important questions, but sometimes we can get lost down the rabbit hole and think, what's the point? As Simona said, sometimes we need to think about the importance of the power within, developing a strong sense of self-worth and agency. So I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own strengths, your own passions. How can you reconnect with your core values to stay grounded and resilient during tumultuous times? At the end of the day, self-awareness is the foundation for leading yourself and others effectively. And I'd like just to send you a personal thank you, Simona, for a great conversation. It was insightful and inspiring. So thank you for sharing your experiences and knowledge, especially when it comes to, the UN leaders who make a difference every day on the global stage. So thanks again. Well, folks, thank you for joining me for another episode. I hope you pulled a lot from it. But until next time we continue this conversation, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.